Am I unmuted now?
You are now.
Okay. Justifiably, James Madison is thought of as the father of the Constitution and/or Bill of Rights. The part in the Constitution dealing with impeachment, was that of his creation, or was that incorporated from somebody else there at the Constitutional Convention?
Well, the convention began with the Virginia plan that had been written by James Madison. And then the impeachment provision, there was a part of that original plan that had talked about impeachment. As we'll see, James Madison wasn't in complete agreement with how it was finished up. We're going to talk about this today, but James Madison thought that the trial should be in the Supreme Court. He didn't think that the Senate should hold the trial. That's a really interesting point that you're making, that James Madison, known as the father of the Constitution, I kind of disagree with that, because there really wasn't one father of the Constitution.
Well, there's something else about Madison. He's thought of as the author of the Bill of Rights, and he had to be persuaded to actually create a Bill of Rights. Initially, he wasn't in favor of it.
Yes, he wasn't in favor of it because he thought you can't just start listing your rights, because, well, what about the rights that aren't included in the list? Would that imply that you don't have those rights?
There was that and the fact that all the other 13 colonies or states had their own Bill of Rights. And I think some people thought it was a redundancy.
It was, yeah, I agree.
And then he was quoted as saying, a piece of paper isn't going to protect our rights necessarily anyway.
Yeah, you're right. And there was a lot in the Finnish Constitution that he disagreed with.
Yeah.
So.
By the way, kudos to you for a great course on the Declaration of Independence and what appears to be a very interesting course on the impeachment of Andrew Johnson.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to be doing the Declaration of Independence class this summer. Exactly the same, because I continue all the time to be learning about that document. So I'll be doing that again for the folks who haven't seen it, or folks that would like to revisit. I never get tired of it.
Well, keep up the good work.
Thank you. Thank you. By the way, we're also putting together a summer class on more on impeachment.
More on impeachment?
Yeah, well, we're going to go more into just the history of impeachment. We're going to look at some of these really interesting cases of federal judges that have been impeached. Also look at the Clinton impeachment, and we'll be able to do a post-mortem on Trump's second impeachment also by then. So it's just such a twisted history.
Yeah.
Get it on yours too if you wanted to.
I could open it up if I want.
Sorry. Oh, there we go.
Yes, I'm glad you're going to be doing the current impeachments also.
Pardon me?
I'm glad you're doing the current impeachments also.
Yeah, well, it's hard to avoid it.
Yes.
It's just, I'm just fascinated. I've been reading the brief on Trump's impeachment, the brief from the House managers. It's just fascinating reading and talking about why it's constitutional, and going back to the framers and the early cases of impeachment, where the trial was held after in one case a senator, in the other case a cabinet officer had already left. It's just fascinating to have, that we're living this history right now.
And I'm sure it's going to go to the full court.
I would hope so. I would hope that it would go to the Supreme Court. My feeling, though, is that if it goes to the Supreme Court isn't going to be swayed by, the precedents of the past of what the Senate decided to do at any one given point in time. My feeling is that the originalists on the court are going to take a dim view of sort of stretching this idea of the trial. Just my thoughts on that. I hope it does go to the Supreme Court. That'll just be a great moment.
And I hope it doesn't, that Trump appointed so many doesn't influence it. That's my only really concern.
Okay,
Well, he did appoint originalists.
Yes, I know.
Yeah.
okay, we're running up on time for class. So once again, unless you're currently asking a question, I ask that you stay muted. If you're going to be moving around, please turn off your camera. You can put your questions either in the chat or raise your hand and you'll get called on to ask your question. And I'm going to hit the go live button on YouTube because this is also being broadcast on YouTube. Make my announcement again. Record this. Oh my goodness, there's so many things to do. Oh, looks like I'm already recording. Good. Okay. Welcome to those of you watching us on YouTube. This is the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. This is an OLLI course brought to you by Osher Lifelong Learning at George Mason. If you would like more information on OLLI at George Mason, please visit our website, olli.gmu.edu. Thank you. Heather, please go ahead.
All righty. Welcome everybody to our second session on the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. What we're going to be doing today is we're going to finish up our background on impeachment, and then we're going to look at some of the earliest applications of impeachment. Then we're going to meet Andrew Johnson. We're going to maybe try to take a look at the character of this man. An interesting question for us is there something about the character of a person that sets him up to be a president who is impeached? It's an interesting problem in history that we always know how things came out. So the tendency, of course, is that we read backwards and we look at all of the events leading up to, say, in this case, the impeachment of Andrew Johnson, and we ask ourselves, well, how did all of these pieces fit together? And particularly the character issue, I think, will be very important with understanding Andrew Johnson and how he came to be our first president to be impeached. And then we're also going to be really digging into the history of this period from 1865 to 1868, because you cannot understand the impeachment of Andrew Johnson without understanding this historic context of the period. I believe just like you can't look at Trump's recent impeachment and only say read the transcript or watch that speech of January 6th and say, well, that explains his impeachment. You have to see it within the context of his 4 years in office. So last time we looked here at these words here in the Constitution, and of course we highlighted here what has become a very timely question about the trial. The trial is supposed to happen in the Senate, and he can be removed from office upon conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Treason and bribery, they don't seem to be the contentious parts of this. It's this question of high crimes and misdemeanors. what is it that makes a high crime or a misdemeanor? Before we move on out of from the framers and the Constitutional Convention, I wanted to talk about one more debate that they held, and that was, well, where should this trial be held? There were some who argued that the trial should be held in the Supreme Court. The argument there, of course, was, remember this concern that the framers had, that one branch would encroach upon the powers of the other. And the framers in particular, they were very worried about how the powers of the legislative branch would grow over time and would crush the powers of the president. And so that they thought that this would be an example of that, of how the Senate, how Congress could use their impeachment power to limit the power of the president. They also argued that the Senate, well, it's too political, that impeachments will simply be a discussion of policy and politics. That James Madison, for one, he objected to the trial being held in the Senate. Madison wanted the trial to be held in the Supreme Court. As he said, the president would be too dependent on the legislative branch for any act which might be called a misdemeanor. So again, it would be far too political. And then there was Pinckney from South Carolina. He said that if the president opposes a favorite law, the two houses will combine against him and, under the influence of heat and faction, throw him out of office. So wanted to keep it out of the Senate because that would be too political. And then, of course, they thought, perhaps the Senate would be too lenient. After all, if they came up with too loose of a definition of high crimes and misdemeanors, that could be turned against them. Now, those others argued that the trial should be held in the Senate. And first of all, they said, well, there are too few justices. We have too few justices, too easy to corrupt these justices. We have many more congressmen, so it would be far more difficult to corrupt that many. He said also, let's remember those justices, they are appointed by the president. Would that mean that the justices would be beholden to the president and would be disinclined to remove him from office? They also said that those that pass judgment on impeachment must be politically accountable. So if we have, say, a runaway Congress and they impeach and remove from office a president who should not have been, well, the people could respond to that by not re-electing these congressmen. Remember, the justices, they serve for life. So there's no way for the people to respond to an unfair impeachment in that case. I want to talk now about a couple of the earliest interpretations here. And of course, Alexander Hamilton, that hip hop star of Broadway. What did he have to say about impeachment in the Federalist Papers? In Federalist 65, where he wrote extensively about the powers of the president, he said, impeachable offenses are those offenses which proceed from the misconduct of public men, or in other words, from the abuse or violation of some public trust. They are of a nature which may with peculiar propriety be denominated political. And that's his emphasis, political. This is a political decision, which is, again, remember why we have the trial in the Senate. This is a political body. It is not a court of justice, as they relate chiefly to injuries done immediately to the society itself. I think we could pause for a moment and think, what would Alexander Hamilton say about the current impeachment effort against Donald Trump? I think we have here a very loose definition of a high crime or misdemeanor. It was misconduct, abuse of the public trust. Furthermore, Hamilton said, as far as where and why we should have the impeachment trial, the division of the process between the two branches of the legislature avoids the inconvenience of making the same person both accusers and judges. So we have the grand jury, that's the House of Representatives, and then the trial will be held in the Senate, and guards against the danger of persecution from the prevalency of a factious spirit in either of those branches. Well, I don't think we've avoided that problem. He's here speaking to a very important theory that the framers held about how our Constitution was going to protect against factions, what their word was for political parties, that it was sort of the expanded sphere of government, because there are so many people and we are so spread out that one faction won't be able to dominate events. And that's what Hamilton hoped for. He also suggested that this process of having the impeachment in the House and the trial in the Senate, that this followed the model, the British model, where the House of Commons impeaches and the House of Lords decides. And then, of course, finally, Hamilton did agree. He said, you know, it's really unavoidable. It's going to be a painful and difficult process, impeachment. He said impeachment will seldom fail to agitate the passions of the whole community. So true. In many cases, it will connect itself with the pre-existing factions and will enlist all their animosities, partialities, influence, and interest on one side or on the other. And in such cases, there will always be the greatest danger that the decision will be regulated more by the comparative strength of parties than by the real demonstrations of innocence or guilt. I think no truer words were said, as we can see right now with what's happening with Republicans versus the Democrats and Trump's second impeachment. I wanted to talk briefly about the first two tests of the process of impeachment, and this was impeaching federal judges. This was the first case was Judge Pickering. He was a district court judge. This was 1803, and he was charged with issuing rulings contrary to his trust and duty as a judge and appearing on the bench in a state of total intoxication. And that was really the problem. He was a notorious drunk, and he would appear in court and was just incoherent. Interesting defense, by the way, put up by his defenders, and that was that well, he wasn't guilty of any high crime or misdemeanor. He was simply crazy, which was an interesting defense if you wanted to keep him in office. In Pickering's case, although he did not commit a specific high crime or misdemeanor, he was convicted and removed. And in this case, well, you clearly just had a man who needed to be removed. However, it's important to stress that his behavior was not found to be criminal. It was simply unacceptable. behavior. The next very important case was Supreme Court Justice Samuel Chase. Now, this was a time when Supreme Court justices, they had to work a lot harder than they do today, that they had to actually ride around and serve as judges in local courthouses. And that's what Samuel Chase did. Now, Samuel Chase, he was a Federalist, and this was a time of some real vicious politicking between the Jeffersonian Republicans and the Federalists. Samuel Chase actually had campaigned very actively for John Adams in the election of 1800, and he hated Thomas Jefferson, and Thomas Jefferson hated him. And Jefferson from the White House was pushing for his impeachment. He was charged, again, not with any specific crime. He was charged with intemperate and inflammatory, peculiarly indecent and unbecoming, highly unwarrantable, highly indecent remarks while speaking in his official capacity. And by today's standards, he was inappropriate in the courtroom. He would, from his desk, he would give political speeches. He would give his opinion on the law, whether or not it was a good law or a bad law. All of this was inappropriate for a judge to do. Chase, in his defense, he says that he could not be impeached for errors in judgment or improper behavior on the bench, but rather only for an indictable offense. In this case, he was acquitted by the Senate. Different Pickering had been convicted and removed. In this case, he was acquitted by the Senate. His behavior had not been criminal. So does anybody have any question right now before we move on? Meg, what do you think?
Yes, we had one question, and I have to get back over to the chat. It was asking, why did the House focus on refusing to enforce Reconstruction instead of tenure in office? But you may want to answer that in the future when you get to.
Yeah, we'll be getting there. I promise we'll get there.
Okay.
All right. Okay. The first president to hear the I word tossed around was John Tyler. John Tyler here, a president of many firsts. He was the first vice president to rise to the presidency on the death of a president. He was the first president to have a veto overridden by Congress. He was the first president to be married while in the White House. He was the first president to have the flag of a foreign nation draped over his coffin. That was the flag of the Confederacy. John Tyler was put on the ticket by William Henry Harrison, who was a Whig, and he put John Tyler, who was a Southern Democrat, on the ticket to try to pull in Democratic votes. Now, this is a lesson that a certain future president, Republican president, will not learn. That maybe that's sort of a risky move. John Tyler, he was a Southern Democrat, states' rights Democrat in heart. He hated Andrew Jackson, and so he left the Democratic Party and superficially became a Whig, but he was not a Whig in his heart. So he immediately, upon becoming the president, he was nicknamed his accidency. And, you know, it's a pertinent question. At this point, nobody really knew what was a vice president supposed to do when the president dies. Is he just a placekeeper? Is he just supposed to wait until there's another election? Is he really just supposed to help carry out the deceased president's policies? John Tyler did not do that. John Tyler immediately began vetoing a lot of the bills coming out of the Whig Congress, and a lot of Whigs really hated him for this reason. There were fist fights that broke out on the floor of Congress between the supporters of Tyler and other Whigs. There was a riot actually out on the streets of Washington, right in front of the White House. These were people that hated Tyler and wanted him removed from office. They said that if the power of impeachment is not exercised by the House in less than 6 months, then 10,000 bayonets will gleam on Pennsylvania Avenue. So tossed around in the House of Representatives was that Tyler was guilty of the high crime and misdemeanor of endeavoring to excite a disorganizing and revolutionary spirit in the country by inviting a disregard of and disobedience to the law of Congress. Those words ring familiar, don't they? Abuse of the veto power to gratify his personal and political resentment, and of being utterly unworthy to have the destinies of this nation in his hands as chief magistrate. So they were tossing around the idea of impeachment. There were never official articles of impeachment written up against him. And I just wanted to put up here what Henry Clay had to say about impeaching a president. Henry Clay was a leader of the Whig Party at this time, and he said, "There is certainly cause enough to impeach this man. There is cause enough, God knows. But it is a novel proceeding, full of important consequences, present and future, and should not be commenced upon, but upon full consideration. Let Tyler serve out his time and go back to Mar-a-Lago. No, I'm sorry. Go back to Virginia, from whence the Whigs have bitter cause to lament that they ever sent him."
That was beautiful.
Anyway, so Henry Clay, leader of the Whig Party, hated John Tyler. However, reluctant to use this tool of impeachment. It's much too dangerous. On the other hand, the response to this, impeachment is too scary, we don't want to pull that tool out of our toolbox. It was, there may be some honest but timid men who fear impeachment would create a sympathy for the president. But to my mind, it would be quite as reasonable to suffer a mad dog to escape that runs through the public streets, biting every living thing he met with, from an apprehension that it might excite a sympathy for him by the cry of "kill him." So let's be careful about impeachment. Well, let's not be too afraid of using impeachment. So I think it's time to meet Andrew Johnson. Before I
Do
move
you
on,
answer a few questions
Yes.
on Tyler?
before I move on, I think it would be a good moment.
Okay, this one goes back a ways. Did the Senate that acquitted Chase have a Federalist majority or a Jeffersonian majority?
You know, I think at that time, the Federalists, let's see, in 1800, 1803, the Federalists may have still had a majority in the Senate? But that's a really good question. I don't know.
Okay, and Tyler, it's at, first of all, you had 1941 as Tyler's date of presidency. That may have been a typo.
Oh, yeah.
1941 as opposed to, so, and they all, Bruce also wanted to say that Tyler was the only president to die as a non-US citizen.
Right. Yeah, because he had gone with the Confederacy. That he was from Virginia. And that's why they had the Confederate flag draped over his coffin.
And Richard Willing adds that John Tyler still has surviving grandchildren 175 years after his presidency.
You're right. You're right. He married a much younger woman, and they had a lot of kids. I mean, all told, I think John Tyler also had more children than any other president. And I think that it was one of the young kids had married, lived a long time, and you're right. I think we still do have a grandchild of John Tyler still living.
Okay, now on to Andrew Johnson.
Okay, who was Andrew Johnson? Well, if you look on the White House website, they have just a little blurb on all the past presidents, and this is what they say about Andrew Johnson. With the assassination of Lincoln, the presidency fell upon an old-fashioned Southern Jacksonian Democrat of pronounced states' rights views. Although an honest and honorable man, Andrew Johnson was one of the most unfortunate of presidents. Arrayed against him were the radical Republicans in Congress, brilliantly led and ruthless in their tactics. Johnson was no match for them. Well, I would say that this is, I think, neutral, if not kind, towards Andrew Johnson. The first sentence I would absolutely agree with. He was an old-fashioned Southern Democrat. He was a slaveholder. He was a real states' rights advocate. Although an honest and honorable man, I don't think there's a lot of evidence that he was a dishonest man. I suppose we'll have to judge how honorable he was. To be honorable, does that mean that you have views and you hold to those views? Well, if that's the definition of honorable, then yes, he was honorable. However, if some of the views that you hold are considered to be fairly despicable views, even in the light of his time, does that make him an honorable man? And yes, Andrew Johnson was one of the most unfortunate of presidents. I think that when we look at the presidents over time and see how difficult was the situation when they became president, if we could sort of give them a difficulty rating on a 1 to 10, I think that we do have a couple of presidents, or we would give them a 10. Certainly that I would include Franklin Roosevelt, with the stock market having crashed and the bank closed and unemployment skyrocketing and nobody knew what to do. I would say Franklin Roosevelt was facing a level of difficulty at the level 10. Certainly Abraham Lincoln, with the southern states seceding. But then, of course, Andrew Johnson, he had to fill the shoes of Abraham Lincoln. An impossible task, really. And of course, he had to figure out how to put this nation back together again after the war. So certainly a level of difficulty at the level 10. Arrayed against him were the radical Republicans in Congress. Very true. He had a Republican Congress. with an overwhelming majority. Brilliantly led, there was some brilliance there. I don't know, they weren't all brilliant. And ruthless, I don't think they were ruthless. I don't think we're going to see any evidence that they were any more ruthless in pursuing their policies than, say, Andrew Johnson was in pursuing his. History has not been kind to Andrew Johnson. There was a poll in 1947 that ranked him 19th out of 29, so sort of lower middle here. All righty. Are we back, everybody?
Yes, ma'am.
So sorry about that. I am here in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, and the wind is blasting outside. And this is just the kind of weather where I tend to lose my internet. So fingers crossed that we can keep on going here. So anyway, I think I was right in the middle of talking about when I had first learned about Andrew Johnson. And that was in Kennedy's book, Profiles in Courage. And in that case, he presented the impeachment of Andrew Johnson as really an out of control Congress used this trumped up law about the Tenure of Office Act to try to drive him out of office. And so it was sort of this man did not deserve and should not have been impeached. So we'll see for ourselves. All righty, so let's get some background here on Andrew Johnson. He was, in fact, born in a log cabin in Raleigh, North Carolina. He was, in the vernacular of the day, he was considered a scrub. That would be one level above poor white trash in the caste system of the South. And he did have he did acquire a profession. He was apprenticed at the age of 10 to become a tailor. He never attended school. He did
Never went to school.
teach himself to.
Andrew Johnson.
He did teach himself to read. He was married at the age of 18. And he moved to Tennessee. The story goes that his wife taught him to write and taught him mathematics. Andrew Johnson never really mastered the skill of writing, and for that reason, studying Andrew Johnson is a bit of a challenge for historians because there's almost nothing in his own hand. The few letters that we do have, the spelling and the grammar is fairly atrocious. So his speeches and his letters as president were certainly written by others. He was a tailor, but he was very much drawn to debating and public speaking. And that's really what drew him into politics. And he did sort of on the ladder, step by step, move up through the different levels. He began as an alderman and then mayor. He was a state representative in Tennessee. He then served in the House of Representatives. He was reelected 5 times. He was elected governor of Tennessee, and then he was elected to the Senate in 1857. He was appointed military governor of Tennessee in 1862, and then he was put on the ticket in 1864. So served at pretty much every level of office that you could possibly serve before he got to the presidency. As I said, Andrew Johnson really loved public speaking. And this was at a time when political speeches and traveling speakers around the country, this was a great form of entertainment. And Andrew Johnson gravitated towards this. And I've included here some of the descriptions of his public speaking style. Altogether, he was forcible and powerful without being eloquent. He held his crowds spellbound. There was always in his speeches more or less wit, humor, and anecdote, which relieved them from tedium and heaviness. He generally, in his speeches, would begin with an outline, but more often than not, would sort of launch into sort of a spontaneous diatribe against whatever was the topic of the day. Sometimes his speeches went too far. He crossed the line, being hard-hitting to being crass and mindlessly vicious. On at least one occasion, in the midst of his speech, he got in a fist fight with somebody who had come to heckle him. And this was also a time with political speeches that it was expected that hecklers would shout up comments and questions to the speaker as the speeches were going on. They said he had a talent for invective and savage ridicule. And as one, actually more than one person said about Andrew Johnson, that he was the best hater I ever knew. Full of pomp and swaggering vanity, and a self-absorbed and lonely man. I think from some of these descriptions, and these are all descriptions that were made by people who knew him or people who were around him, we're getting again some insight into the character of Andrew Johnson, and to begin to answer that question of, well, what kind of a man is there? Is there a temperament? Is there a mindset? Is there a way of behaving and carrying yourself that can set you up for impeachment? So Andrew Johnson was in the Senate when the South seceded. And Andrew Johnson was the only representative from a seceded state to remain in his seat. For that reason, when Tennessee was brought back under control by the Union Army, Abraham Lincoln appointed him to be the military governor of Tennessee. 1864, Lincoln's reelection in 1864. Now, of course, we know of Abraham Lincoln as having been a great, if not the greatest president. So it's difficult to realize that in 1864, many thought that he was not going to be reelected. In early 1864, recall that the war was not going well for the Union, and there were many folks who were advocating that we need to have some sort of a peaceful settlement, reconciliation to end the war. Hoping to bring in more votes, Abraham Lincoln decided to get rid of his wonderfully named Vice President Hannibal Hamlin and put Andrew Johnson on the ticket as a show of unity. Andrew Johnson, he was a Southerner, he was a Democrat, and Lincoln, as a matter of fact, did not run on the Republican ticket. It was a new party. It was the National Union party. And so Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson were running on the National Union Party. Here's a political cartoon of the day suggesting what Reconstruction was going to be like under Lincoln and Andrew Johnson. That Andrew Johnson was the tailor, and all we needed to do was sort of stitch things up and get the country back together again. You know, this tendency to try to select a vice president with the hope of bringing in more votes, as opposed to looking around and really choosing the one who is most suited to be president in the event something happening to the president is an important question. The 12th Amendment, before the way our Constitution was originally written, in the election for the president, whoever came in second place would be the vice president. This system jammed up pretty quickly with the election of 1800, when there was a tie, and it had to go to the House of Representatives, and it was just chaos. And folks quickly realized that having your political enemy as vice president was perhaps not the best idea. So the 12th Amendment changed our system so that a vice president and the president would run together on a ticket. At that time, though, when the 12th Amendment was being discussed in Congress, this is what was said. Rather than asking of a VP candidate, is he capable? Is he honest? We ask, can he, by his name, by his connections, by his wealth, by his location, on and on, that best promotes the election of a president? And I think we'd have to agree that's true. When a presidential nominee is looking around for his vice president, doesn't necessarily ask himself who would absolutely be the best president if something were to happen to me, but it happens for political considerations. And certainly we see that with Andrew Johnson. He was a man who was ill-suited to be president in 1865. So, inauguration, March 4th, 1865. Have you ever attended a wedding reception where a drunken best man stands up to give an interminable, incoherent toast? Well, if you have, then you kind of know what happened when Andrew Johnson stood up to give his speech at his inauguration, at Lincoln's inauguration, and when he was sworn in to be vice president. Now, the story goes, and it depends on how favorably inclined you are towards Andrew Johnson. Some say that Andrew Johnson was had a very bad cold and that he had been self-medicating with a little bit of brandy, and then at some of the gatherings before the inauguration, he maybe had a little bit too much to drink.
He had a cold.
Some, though, say, in fact, Andrew Johnson was a closet drunk, and on this occasion, his drunkenness came out for all to see. He stands up and he gives a rambling, incoherent speech, slurring his words, making all these crazy stage whispers to people around him. One person who was there said, "All eyes were turned to Mr. Johnson. With wild gesticulations and shrieks began his address. His behavior was that of an illiterate, vulgar, and drunken rowdy. Mr. Johnson was so proud of the dignity into which his fate had thrust him that he boasted of it in the language of a clown. He ends his speech by picking up a Bible and landing a big sloppy kiss right on the Bible, and he sits down. Well, immediately there is talk of this was an embarrassment to the office, that he needed to resign. This was a national disgrace. He was a laughingstock. He kind of disappeared from view. Those around him said that, well, he was just recovering from whatever it was that he had been suffering from, his bad cold or typhus or whatever. And really nothing was seen of Andrew Johnson over the next couple of weeks. Abraham Lincoln, in Johnson's defense, he says, "I have known Andy Johnson for years. He made a bad slip the other day, yeah, but you need not be scared. Andy ain't a drunkard." Well, so said Abraham Lincoln. So we don't see anything of Andrew Johnson from March 4th until April 15th, a few weeks later, when Lincoln is shot and Andrew Johnson comes to his bedside, where he says, "They shall suffer for this." For the next couple of weeks, Andrew Johnson, he does carry himself with tremendous dignity. He's not drunk and incoherent, and people are hopeful that he will be able to rise to the moment, and that he will be able to lead our country through this very difficult time. Of course, we can't have a presidential assassination without there being a conspiracy theory. We know that the plot to kill Lincoln was more widespread. Secretary of State Seward had been attacked at his home. He survived the attack. George Atzerodt had been sent to kill Johnson, and he lost his nerve and didn't carry that out. This is the most amazing thing, though. John Wilkes Booth, the day before the assassination, came by Johnson's home and left this note: "Don't wish to disturb you. Are you at home? John Wilkes Booth." Now, imagine, if you will, after the assassination of Kennedy, if such a note had been found from Lee Harvey Oswald to Lyndon Johnson: "Don't wish to disturb you. Are you at home?" Can you imagine? Don't really know anything about that note, what that was about. Nonetheless, it did feed the conspiracy theory that percolated for a little bit. This conspiracy theory will continue sort of there in the background, and we will get back to that when we are looking at the impeachment attempts against Andrew Johnson, and there are many of them. I just love this this photo here, and this again speaks to the early days of Johnson's administration here. Here he is up on this viewing stand, watching the parade, and there is Grant and Johnson and Secretary of the Navy Gideon Wells, and then the generals Sherman, Rosencrantz, and Meade. And there was a hope that Andrew Johnson could have it in him to be a great president and to lead us through this period. So, into the context of what is happening and what is facing Andrew Johnson, and the big questions facing our country immediately after the war. First big question: which branch of government is in charge of Reconstruction policy? Is it the president or is it Congress? What is the status of the rebels and the southern states? And of course, most important, what is the status of these 4 million freed slaves? How will they be cared for? We have 4 million slaves who have been released in the worst possible way that the slaves could have been freed. They have been freed into a society that has been destroyed politically, economically, and socially. Freed into a society not at all happy with how the freedom to the slaves came about. And of course, one of the most important questions was, will the slaves be given the right to vote? As far as which branch of government is in charge, well, Lincoln and Johnson, they both held to this belief that secession was constitutionally impossible. The southern states had never actually seceded, that the southern states had never actually created their own nation. And because the states had never seceded, the president has the power to oversee Reconstruction policy. In Article 2, Section 2, he shall have power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States. So that was really all that needed to happen as far as Reconstruction was concerned. We needed to pardon the rebels and get on with life. On the other side, and this was the view held by the Republicans, was that the southern states, when they seceded, that they had basically committed suicide, that they no longer existed as states, that the southern states had reverted to territorial status, and that therefore Congress had the power. They found this power in Article 4, Section 3. The Congress shall have power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States. So in other words, the South had, the states were gone, and this was a territory now, and that Congress had the power. Now, this technical question here of what actually had happened when the South seceded, that because secession was constitutionally impossible, therefore they had not seceded. Some responded to that and said that, well, because murder is illegal, killing can't happen. Lincoln believed that, held this position. However, he did have the flexibility of mind to realize that, well, secession wasn't constitutionally impossible, but certainly something huge had happened, and something really major needs to happen as we pull these states back into the Union. Lincoln referred to this question about whether or not secession was constitutionally impossible as a pernicious abstraction. So just when we look at these questions and how Johnson is going to answer these questions, I wanted to just take a minute to look and see, well, how was Lincoln, to the best of our knowledge at this time of his death, how was he going to address these questions? First of all, the status of the rebels and the southern states. In his proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction in 1863, he said that the Confederates would be pardoned if they took a loyalty oath and acknowledged the 13th Amendment, and that the states could form new governments after 10% of voters took the oath. Now, let's recall that the war was still going on. So when he issues this proclamation, Was this really going to be his policy, or was he just communicating to the Southerners? He said, listen, it's going to be really easy to get back into the Union. Just put down your arms and we'll make up and move forward. He makes no mention of Black suffrage at that time. Later on, and in his second inaugural address, again, you're addressing this question of what would be the status of the Southern states. And of course, these beautiful words that he wrote: with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan. So, the status of 4 million freed slaves. What was going to be his policy? Well, in the last speech that Lincoln gave in April 1865, he says, as far as the vote goes, I would myself prefer that it were now conferred on the very intelligent and on those who serve our cause as soldiers. So clearly inclined to give this some thought. In the present situation, as the phrase goes, it may be my duty to make some new announcement to the people of the South I am considering, and shall not fail to act when satisfied that action will be proper. So in other words, Lincoln was thinking about Reconstruction. He had some new plan that he was ready to propose, but we sadly do not know what that plan was. So Andrew Johnson takes control. From April 1865, and I meant through April through December 1865, Congress is out of session. For all of these months now, he is really able to operate as a king. And Thomas Nast, who was a very popular political cartoonist of the day, very early on began portraying Andrew Johnson as King Andrew in his political cartoons. And what Johnson does from April through December of 1865, when Congress is out of session, and he has taken Reconstruction into his own hands, what he does is he appoints new governors. And these governors were meant to call a constitutional convention. The only thing that was required of these conventions that were going to be writing up new state constitutions was to ban slavery and renounce secession. And that is all. The states could decide for themselves about the issue of voting. And actually the states could decide for themselves about all issues that would concern the health and the welfare and the protection of the freed slaves. So what about the rebels? What was the status of the rebels? Well, let's remember now that Andrew Johnson, he is a Southerner, he's a slaveholder, he's a states' rights Democrat. So when he looks at the rebels, we might naturally expect him to feel very sympathetically inclined towards their treatment. And he announced that they would be granted amnesty using his pardoning power. The only exception to this broad grant of amnesty was to the very wealthy. For anybody who held property worth more than $20,000, that they must come and ask him personally for a pardon. Now that's sort of interesting situation here. Broad amnesty, and actually all will be forgiven, but the very wealthy need to come to me personally, get down on their knees and ask for a pardon. Now, what I picture here is the bullied child's fantasy of revenge, if you will. Remember that Andrew Johnson had grown up in this very class conscious Southern society where he had been looked down upon, and he hated, truly hated this the planter aristocracy, those in the upper class who had looked down upon him. It was there they are, the hated planter aristocracy. So the idea of having these folks who would always look down upon him and that he'd always felt belittled by, having these folks come to him and ask him personally for a pardon was something that he enjoyed. It was said that of his hatred for the planter aristocracy of the South. If Andy Johnson were a snake, he would hide in the grass and bite the heels of rich men's children. Clearly, Andrew Johnson enjoyed this process of granting pardons to the South. They came in droves, and they were supplicants here to Andrew Johnson. By 1866, Johnson had granted individual pardons to 7,000 wealthy Southerners. Now, since they all had to come in person, I'm not really sure how that happened. That seems like an awful lot in a short period of time. But pretty much anybody who came and asked for the pardon was granted a pardon by Andrew Johnson. And Andrew Johnson also clearly enjoyed this time of having the Southern aristocrats come to him, and he spent time with them and listened to them, and he really became comfortable believing that he was now really one of them. We can stop here, Meg, if there are any questions. We have about 15 minutes left.
Jody Smith was asking you to explain the president appointing new governors.
Well, it was just something that Johnson took upon himself. Here was that we needed, in other words, he recognized the fact that there was some need for reconstruction here, and that we needed to have new constitutions written. So he would appoint governors. He just took that as one of his presidential powers. As we'll see, that not everybody agreed that that was a presidential power, but he would appoint somebody. And remember, the primary role of the governor was to call a convention so that a new state constitution could be written.
And Arthur and Osamol, or however that is pronounced, are both asking, did the wealthy need to come bearing gifts to get pardoned?
He didn't say. I wouldn't be surprised. Maybe a bottle of brandy. No, no, they just had to come in person and sort of, meet him at his throne in the White House.
And Bonnie Nelson has her hand up.
I wondered if he finally got rid of his slaves. It sounded like he still had them at the end of the war.
Oh, well, no, he had been a slave. He had been a slaveholder himself, but obviously with the passage of the 13th Amendment, he didn't have them anymore.
Okay. Thank you.
And Lee Kellen asked, did Lincoln write his own speeches?
Lincoln, yes, Lincoln did write his own speeches, and I really think that it speaks to the genius of that man. Lincoln wrote words that no other president, I believe, has ever been able to match. Lincoln did write his own speeches. Andrew Johnson definitely did not write his own speeches, though.
And they're asking again about your Congress was out of session. Were they out of session from April to December? Was that usual?
Yes.
Were they?
Yes. They were out of session.
So
And
how long did Congress usually serve? Did they only serve 4 months a year, or?
Good question. I mean, I know that it was that they were out of session from April through December. I don't know what the rules were at that time for how many months they would be. Oops, just getting another notice from my computer. There you go, that my battery's running low. That's all we need to do, right? Is lose my computer again. All right. No, I don't know what the rules were at that time. I just know that they weren't going to be back in session until December.
Okay. Your slide says April to May, and you said earlier that May was wrong. It was December.
Yeah, right. It was still
Yeah.
December. I made a mistake there.
Yeah. So I'm just reading real quick through. And Anita, you've had your hand up for a long time. Did you actually have a question? And we have two more, John Meyer and Sally Burdick.
No, I do have a question.
Okay, go ahead, please.
Okay, actually, when I took this class, not really a question, it's just an interesting comment, a postscript. When I took this class, I thought it was the impeachment of Andrew Jackson, okay? Because Andrew Jackson was a total nut. And I thought he was the one all my life. I thought it was Jackson and not Andrew Johnson. So it's a very good class. And now I learned something else. So thank you. Because Jackson was the one that I think would be most like, you know who, but he was never impeached. So, okay, that's it.
Andrew Jackson, Congress did vote to censure Andrew Jackson, the first and only president to be censured. Of course, that's really just a slap on the wrist saying that you've done a very, very bad thing. And, you know, that there are some, of course, that believe that should be done for Trump, that he just should be censured.
Censured, right. But anyway, I forgot that it was Andrew Johnson.
Yeah.
So, but it's a good class and I did learn something, but all the time I thought I was going to hear about Jackson. But
Wow.
thank you very much.
I hope you're not disappointed.
Okay,
No, I'm not at all. No, of course not. Whatever I can learn is important. Thank you.
Okay, John Meyer.
Yes, thank you very much. I find this class very unique in its presentation. On the subject of Andrew Johnson wanting to personally see supplicants to receive pardons, I think part of that was the message that he conveyed to them. First, that he was in charge. Second, that they were not in charge, and that whatever orders he dictated through the governors that he appointed were to be obeyed by people who had formerly been in privilege. And that particular piece of it was backed up by the US Army occupying the southern states. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we will soon see, though, that the policies that he is enforcing here in the South would be policies that the Southern aristocrats would not have objected to. All righty. So what about the status of these 4 million freed slaves here? Well, Andrew Johnson here, you know, it really needs to be said that Andrew Johnson was a deeply racist man. And of course, this was at a time when just about everybody, North and South, were deeply racist. But even for his day, the racism that he felt towards blacks was quite profound and extraordinary, even for his times. What he had to say about the freed slaves and the vote. This is a country for white men. And by God, as long as I am president, it shall be a government for white men. And then as far as caring for the freed slaves, do they get the right to vote? What would be any legal protections for them? What sort of political or civil rights would they have? Johnson said, you know what? That's a state issue. It's not up to the federal government to make those determinations. It's up to the states that they can decide for themselves. All righty, so finally, December of 1865, the 39th Congress here finally convenes, and they convene with a very large Republican majority. And showing up here to take their seats, now we call these Johnson governments, these governments that had been put together in this period from April through December when Congress was out of session. And this was Andrew Johnson who was appointing governors, and the governors were writing they were having new constitutions written, and these states then were electing their representatives, and these representatives were coming to Washington to take their seats in Congress. And lo and behold, who shows up? Who gets elected to Congress from these southern states? Well, notorious and unpardoned rebels, men who could not take the prescribed oath of office and who made no secret of their hostility to the government and the people of the United States. Showing up here to take a seat in Congress, you had none other than Alexander Stephens, former vice president of the Confederacy, 10 former Confederate generals, 7 members of the Confederation Congress, many members of the secession conventions. Now, just take a moment and imagine what this felt like then in Congress for these Republican congressmen who are watching walk in the door and take their seats in the Senate and the House of Representatives. These folks who had been responsible for the bloodshed of these last 4 or 5 years, 4.5 years. Every single one of those congressmen had family and friends who had died or been injured as a result of the actions of these men. And now they're just going to come in there and quietly take their seats and get on with life. Well, they were not allowed to take their seats in Congress. Article 1, Section 5. Each house shall be the judge of the elections, returns, and qualifications of its own members. So Congress did not allow these Southern representatives to take their seats. They were sent home. Now, you might be asking yourself, why didn't the House of Representatives recently refuse to let that QAnon spokesperson, gun-toting representative from Georgia? Why did they let her take her seat? Well, interestingly enough, I think in 1966, the Supreme Court ruled that in fact, Congress could not do what the 39th Congress did. That if that they couldn't turn away any representatives that had been elected, that they couldn't turn over an election, that they have the power to expel, but they cannot prevent any representative from taking their seat who had been legitimately elected. So they do not take their seat, and the 39th Congress now has no representatives from the southern states. Oops, and I think we're almost out of time. So do we have any questions to wrap up with at the end here?
You have one where there are other presidents and VPs that were from different parties.
Well, we did have John Tyler and William Henry Harrison. That was the previous example, and we know how that worked out.
And then there's a suggestion for a future class, the Hayes-Tilden election of 1876, pardon me, and its impact on race relations in the South, the beginning of Jim Crow, the disenfranchisement of Blacks, and the creation of the Solid South.
Yeah, and I think what we're seeing, and that's really important, and I think what we're seeing here is we're not only, and I'm digging into a lot of what was going on here to set the stage for the impeachment of Andrew Johnson, but of course we are also setting the stage for how, when we get into the 1870s here, that there is just going to be this exhaustion with dealing with the problems of the South, and worrying about the welfare of the freed slaves. And that's really what that compromise that gave Hayes the presidency was really all about. It was just an exhaustion. Let's get on with life. Let's reconcile and let bygones be bygones.
Okay, and that's all I have right now. I don't have any hands up, and I don't have any more comments.
Great. Well, I'm glad that the internet lasted. I'm really sorry about that glitch.
Can you take a question?
Sure.
In the picture that's displayed, it looks like there is one black man just right of center, and this is 1865. Can you tell me anything about what that might be about?
No, that was just a picture that I pulled up of the 39th Congress, but no.
Okay, that's interesting.
Interesting point.
You got some. I love all the photographs that you display. They're really good.
Thank you. They're fun.